French police shot dead a 17-year-old teenager of Algerian heritage last month in a Paris suburb. It was a routine traffic stop. The police seem initially to have lied about what happened until a video posted on social media showed otherwise. The shooting led to riots across the country. It was the 16th fatal police shooting since last year. What is going on in France? To help us unpack this, we are joined by Dr Kawtar Najib. She is a lecturer in human geography at the University of Liverpool. She has researched anti-Muslim hate crimes and how they map to specific regions in London, England, and Paris, France. Assalamu alaikum, welcome to the show.
Alaikum salam. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much for joining us. Let's just start a little by focusing on the incident itself. I've got some quotes here and things that I'm going to read to you. And the first one is from the Green Party leader in France, who it was quoted in France 24 the day after the shooting, which the day after was Wednesday, June the 28th. She said, "What I saw on this video is the execution by police of a 17-year-old kid in France in 2023 in broad daylight." Do you think that she's exaggerating by calling it an execution?
No, I think it's right because when you see the video, it's quite clear. We have a 17-year-old French Algerian boy who took a car, even if he doesn't have a license, drive license, but he took a car, a beautiful car, and he wanted to have a ride with his friend. And then he saw the police. The police stopped him. He had to stop. But then the police started to be very violent because he stopped the first time. And we have other videos showing that he was beaten up. So he had to flee. And when he decided to stop a second time, he was killed. And in this video, we can see a police officer telling him that I'm going to shoot you in the head. And then telling to his colleague, another a police officer, to shoot him. And he said twice, shoot, shoot. And then he shot him.
I mean, this is just really sad. We pray for his soul and for the family. I gather that some of the French politicians, the elites, so the Prime Minister, the President, and the Interior Minister spoke out against what had happened. The Macron called it inexcusable, and the French National Assembly held a moment of silence in the Teens Honour the next day. But I've read that people say this kind of criticism, government criticism of the police, is rare, and that the police union itself was not very happy with this kind of response, I guess. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit to us about police violence and how the government normally handles it.
It's true that Macron, just after this killing, said that it was unacceptable, but he said the same thing for the other victims of police violence, and we have many in France, and all are brown and black people, young boys, sometimes not too young, and after saying that it was unacceptable, nothing changed. We still have police officers who killed those boys, those men, without any repercussion. We even have the police union that tried to protect the police officer who killed Nahel, this 17-year-old French Algerian man, and they tried to protect him. They even it's a far right political celebrity who even developed a fundraising pot to help his wife defend him, and this money he raised 1.6 million of money. So it's disproportionate. The police union as well as the government protect those police officers, and the justice for the police, the victims of the police crime are still, we are still waiting for the justice.
So the way you describe it then, that does make it seem rare that the Prime Minister and the President would speak out against it. Are you able to shed light on maybe why they would have spoken out against it in the face of the lack of action that you've just described?
What you mean exactly?
So if they normally don't hold the perpetrators accountable, if they normally allow this to continue, if there's no conversation about police reform, why do you think they spoke out this time?
No, they have not spoken up. It's just that they said that it was unacceptable, but they said the exact same thing for the other victims of police crime, the previous one, and we have many for decades now, and they said that it was unacceptable, but nothing really changed. The situation is the same, and especially the sanction for those police officers who committed those crimes are minimal or non-existent.
I haven't been able to find out much about what's happened to the police officer concerned. Are you able to update us on what's happened?
I think is now in jail, but the police. The other colleagues try to defend him, try to um, make these cases not possible. We even have the president of the police saying that having a police officer in jail is not possible. But we're waiting for the judgment of these police officers.
In the US, we had the similar tragic killing of a black man called George Floyd, and it sparked a movement called Black Lives Matter. And I'm aware that the US is not necessarily your area of expertise, but I'm wondering, does French society confront this systemic racism, or is there a similar Black Lives movement that might have resulted from this killing of the poor Nahel in France?
There is a clear similarities with what happened in the US and George Floyd and what happened in France and the killing of Nahel, because we had a video showing two racialized person being attacked and killed by a police officer who represent the state. They are agents of the state, and they dominate those people. So we have a clear similarities, but the difference between the US and and France is the fact that in France we don't recognize race and religion. So in France, people from racial and religious minority groups cannot really organize themselves and cannot be recognized as communities. And because of that, it's very hard for them to be able to ask and claim anything and to try to develop things that would help them to protect themselves. So I know that in the US we talk about Black Lives Matter. In France, we can't really talk about Black and Brown French people lives matter, but this is the reality on the ground. In France, France does not recognize race and religion. It's in the constitutions because France does not want to separate all the communities living in France, and they say that French people is one and indivisible. But on the reality on the ground, it's not true. We are not equal. We are not all equal.
That's a really interesting difference between US secularism and French secularism. And I read that in France, the collection of ethnicity data is actually against the law.
Yeah.
So how does the society then deal with these issues? What's the conversation like?
That's a really good question. This is what we need. We need in France to have those data being recognized, because once those data will be recognized, we'll be able to show all the discrimination that affect brown and black people in France. And there are many, not just horrible stuff that happens on the ground, like the killing of our young brothers, but also discrimination that affect your education, that affect your job. It's very hard for people who lives in the banlieue, those peripheral areas where there is a great high concentration of minority groups and high concentration of poverty. So it's very hard for them to find decent accommodation, decent jobs. And if race and religion would be accepted and recognized, we would be able to show very alarming statistics showing all this discrimination. And once we will be able to be recognized and show the discrimination, then we will probably be able to develop laws to protect those minorities.
We're going to have a short break now. When we come back, we'll delve into this more systemic racism in France and what happened after the shooting of the French teen. Don't go away. We're talking with Dr. Kawtar Najib about the shooting of a French teenager of Algerian heritage and the aftermath. I know that there were riots, I think the night of, and then a massive police presence. I'll just check some of the figures, something like 40,000 officers mobilized, driving around in armored vehicles. There was rioting and looting, something like 5,000 vehicles set on fire, more than 700 police officers injured, 10,000 garbage cans burned. I'm not sure, maybe you can explain why garbage cans. Nearly 1,000 buildings had been burnt. And then the victim's grandmother went out and appealed for calm. And I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about the riots. I know that everyone had in their mind the 2005 riots that was initiated by a similar police killing of teenagers. What's the situation now? Like, tell us a little bit about what's happened then.
Yeah. So first of all, this is not riots. They are protests and revolts. Those people who wanted to stand up against those big injustice, because we are talking about a police officer killing a young teenager for nothing. There were absolutely no violence in the situation. So they stand up against injustice because there is a systemic racism in France, and this is things that happens for decades and decades. And so they stand up against racism and Islamophobia that are embedded in institutions in France.
Now, you've just corrected me and said these are not riots, these are protests. And I remember in the 2005 times, there was a discourse in some media, some academic circles, that this kind of violent protest was somehow rooted in Islamic cultural violence. I'm wondering, are you seeing the same kind of reaction? Is that why I got this from the media? I guess we use the word riots because this is quote unquote some kind of cultural thing that Arab heritage Muslim people do.
This is also how they portray it in French media. They portray it as riots in order to just show that this is random events, but it's not. It's something that is deeper, that has deeper roots on racism and Islamophobia in France. So that's why it's better to present those events as protests and revolts. I'm not sure there are a similarity with the riots in the Islamic world, but you said, like your previous question, you said that the mother or the grandmother of Nael asked for calm to calm down the situation, and I know that in the French political and media sphere, we have politicians going on TV shows and explaining that those protests that last 5 days, they stopped thanks to the intervention of imams and gangsters. So they want to say that the areas where those people live are controlled by Islamically religious leaders and thugs. So they want to portray those areas as very dangerous and as controlled by Islamists and gangsters, to better portray the fact that those areas are no-go area, and the people who live there are enemies of the Republic.
Now, you've started talking about areas and spaces, and I think now it's time to bring in your expertise, which is, mapping geographic spaces. And you have done some studies comparing London, England, and Paris, France, mapping acts of anti-Muslim hate crime. And I was wondering if you could tell us, I know that young Nahel was shot in the western region of Paris called Nanterre. How did the mapping, when you did your anti-Muslim hate crimes of Paris, how does Nanterre map?
I have not seen specifically Nanterre being an area that was affected by Islamophobia, or an area that was specifically spotted for racism. But the mapping I've built for my research on Islamophobia in France and London, for the Parisian case, I was able to show that Islamophobia describe center periphery urban model, where where Islamophobic acts happen in great majority in the Parisian center, the prestigious Parisian center. And when we know that the Muslim community in great majority live in the banlieue, in the peripheries, and in great majority in north east of Paris, we can understand that when they leave those areas, then Islamophobic acts are more possibility to happen outside of those areas, and mainly in the Parisian center.
Mm. One of the things that I found interesting about your study, you found that 64% of Islamophobic acts occurred in public institutions, and the media are reporting that the violent protests that happened after Nahel's shooting were attacking public institutions like town halls, libraries, schools, and buses. And I wonder if you could explain to us, what's the issue with public institutions?
Yes, it's a good link. It's a very good link. That's true that in France, the great majority of public Islamophobic act happen in public institutions, which was absolutely not the case for the British case. For London, the great majority of those anti-Muslim acts happen in public areas and public transport, and they are verbal aggression. In France, they are discrimination happening in public institutions. So those things can show a clear link with systemic racism that are still present in public institutions. And when those kids who revolt and wanted to um, show their protest and burn and degrade, destroy all the public institutions, maybe the message is to say that those public institutions are not ours. Those public institutions don't recognize us. When we go to school, we don't have the best education. When we try to find a job, we don't get what we deserve in link with what we have, the degrees, because we have many people having good degrees but not being able to find a job in France, just because they are brown or black or Muslims, and so they feel the need to go abroad for most of them. So it's probably a message to tell that those public institutions where we are discriminated in great majority, maybe we want to show that they are not ours.
We're almost out of time. I just want to see if I can squeeze in one more question related to what you were saying about these young people who have degrees but can't get jobs. And your research found that 32% of the victims of Islamophobia were youth. And the media are reporting that the average age of the protesters is 17. So again, is there this connection between what's happening to the youth with systemic racism and the protests that happened after Nahel was shot?
Yes, there is a clear link. I'm not sure for those people who have to flee France to find a job. Are they're probably not 17 years old. They're probably older, to first finishing the degrees and try to find a job because they love France. They want to live in France. They want to stay in France. So they try. They try many times. And once they see that it's not possible to find anything, then they leave. So they will probably have 25, 30 years old to make this decision. But for the very young kids who decided to go at night and protest, yes, they are very young. They are very, very young, even younger than 17 years old. And I have seen personally images of children being handcuffed and arrested by the French police. And I don't know the fate of those kids. I know that some of them had very, very important sanctions, but can we really arrest and handcuff children in France? That's my question.
Well, that's a very deep question to end on. Unfortunately, we can't explore it more now. We're out of time, but thanks very much for joining us and talking to us about your research and how it maps onto what's going on in France. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching. If you like what we do, please share, like, and subscribe. Stay safe and God bless.